Oh man, there's a lot going on here. This is a busy Monday morning as I was just bracing myself for a week of studying draft picks, all this other nonsense. The Texans pull off a couple of, I would say, stunning trades, not of the major marquee value, but for a team that has a lot of work to do on the offensive side of the ball. On this Believe in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel, we got to discuss two big things the Texans did where they flipped the offense all around on a Monday heading into free agency. They trade away Tytus Howard this morning for a 5th round pick. He immediately signs a 3-year, $66 million or so deal with the Cleveland Browns. And then a few hours later, as we're just digesting this Tytus Howard pick and what it might mean, the Texans trade for running back David Montgomery. It was initially reported as a 5th round pick. It was later revised to be a 4th round pick, a 7th round pick, and Juice Scruggs traded his way as well. So a heftier price than initially reported, unless some of those picks are future picks or anything. That news will all come down over the next the course of several hours. But really, how to attack all of this from the very beginning? I think if we go by the timeline, the response to the Tytus Howard trade was interesting. We're on our radio show. Sean Pendergast did a great poll, as he typically does when it comes to asking about stuff like this. He just simply asked whether Texans fans approved or disapproved of this trade of Tytus Howard. At the time, I believe 65% disapproved. And then when the news of the Montgomery trade comes out a few hours later, the numbers started to skew a little bit, and then people felt like, all right, okay, they got a plan here, and they're not just stabbing in the dark. And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, you find out that the David Montgomery trade is way more expensive than it initially sounded, and you're getting a 7th-year, 8th-year running back for a pretty hefty compensation. I think for me, this is where I am. The thing that's holding me back on the Tytus Howard trade, we'll go through the Tytus Howard trade first, is two things. One is, okay, you only got a 5th rounder back. That part of it makes sense in that obviously Tytus was going into the final year of his contract. I think he looked at himself as a $22 million a year offensive tackle. I don't think the Texans looked at him as a $22 million a year offensive tackle. So in trying to plan for the long term and get guys that can be here for a few years, they probably looked at it as a bit of a lost cause to keep him around for one more year. Cool. That makes sense philosophically, but you trade him away and now you got 4 question marks on the offensive line. The other part of it is just simply that part, the money part of it and the trade compensation part of it. The money part of it, I'm okay with that. The trade compensation, I trust Caserio when it comes to figuring out what the value of a player is that they're trading away. Whether or not they're too aggressive in acquiring players, that's a whole nother story, and that's much more up to debate, especially when we get to David Montgomery. But with Tytus Howard, I think that you've got a good player in Tytus Howard. He's a competent NFL starter. I don't think that he's necessarily as good as he or his representation feels that he is. I think, like I said, the Texans value his versatility more so than they do his upper end ceiling as an offensive tackle. So if you can replace him with somebody in free agency or via trade for a better price, that makes sense. Or on a longer contract, if you get them at a value that you really like them at, then that's cool. But very few of us really trust Nick Caserio or the Texans to put a good offensive lineman out there. Last year when they traded away Laremy Tunsil, that trade compensation made sense. That trade compensation was largely looked at by the people who do all the calculations and everything. It's like, oh, okay, this makes sense. You trade that amount for Laremy Tunsil. They go and they draft Ariante Ursary in the 2nd round, and I'm happy with the development of Ariante Ursary. But beyond that, last year when it looked like they were setting themselves up for an aggressive rebuild of the offensive line. They got rid of 3 of the starters from the opening week of 2024. They weren't aggressive at all. They signed Cam Robinson. They signed Laken Tomlinson. They signed Trent Brown to a 1-year deal. They traded for Ed Ingram, who is basically, they had 1 year of control on him. The Ed Ingram part of it worked out. None of those other very, very boring free agency moves really worked out. Other than Trent Brown worked out, except he also, as you might expect from a guy who's rarely been healthy in his career, he wasn't healthy and he wasn't available for the final and most important game of the season against the New England Patriots. So the way they addressed the offensive line last offseason, it was not enough. It was not enough when you're trying to get the most out of your quarterback, your young quarterback, and then you don't end up getting the most out of your young quarterback. Then you kick the can 1 year down the road, and we're in the same position again, where you don't really feel any sense of certainty about the offensive line. You feel you've got 4 question marks, and you've got one guy in Ariante Ursary who I'm bullish on, and yet he's not the guy that you can just pencil in as, oh yeah, he's a bona fide starter. He's going to be awesome no matter what. This is the situation we find ourselves in yet again. The aggression of today makes me feel comfortable that, all right, Caserio understands the assignment and he's going to be way more aggressive about it this offseason. He's going to do something along the lines of what the Texans or what the Bears did last year, where they added 3 veterans to their roster before the draft, and then they went in and drafted an offensive lineman as well. That's the kind of aggressive bolstering up of this offense that they need to do. The Texans on FanDuel, for what it's worth, before this trade, were tied for 7th favorites to win the conference this year. We'll see. I don't think today's moves are going to change that at all. Free agency and then the draft, obviously, are going to be the big deal with that. Do you guys trust that Nick Caserio is actually going to be aggressive enough? Do you trust that he's actually going to do something to where you feel better about this team on paper headed into the draft than they are right now? I get the sense that there's a lot of pessimism out there, and I get it, and it's 100% justified because they haven't had a good offensive line since Nick has been here. You know, Nick said during the combine that he felt that this last year was the best they'd played on the offensive line since he's been here. I went back and I looked at the Pro Football Focus final rankings from all the years that Nick has been here. The best they were was 15th in 2023, which was a little bit of a surprise. Everything else was 27th, 28th, 29th. I think there was a 31st in there. It's been really poor offensive line play. In this last year, even after they stabilized when Tytus moved down to left guard and Trent Brown was playing right tackle, they stabilized, but they also didn't necessarily face the huge gauntlet of stud interior defensive linemen that would give them so many issues at various times in the first part of the season. They did face those stud interior defensive linemen in the Patriots game, and we saw exactly what happened. They got taken to the woodshed in a game and in a night where you really, really should have been able to run the football. They couldn't run the football, which brings us, of course, to David Montgomery. David Montgomery, to recap the trade again, it was a 4th-round pick, a 7th-round pick, and Juice Scruggs. I'm not going to cry a million tears over the loss of Juice Scruggs. I think there's potential in Juice Scruggs. I think there's a chance that he could develop into something, but that's I don't almost even calculate that with the trade discussion or the trade value. I think the Lions likewise they're trying to bolster their interior offensive line. They're going to add Juice Scruggs to a guy that's in the mix, and maybe they get the most out of him. Maybe they think he'll get better coaching in Detroit. That'd be a reasonable thing for them to think if they've watched the last few years of the Texans. I like Cole Popovich as an offensive line coach. I think it's going to take a couple years for his effect to really show through, especially with some of the younger offensive linemen. So I wanted to give him another year, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. As Greg asked, do we trust D'Amico to evaluate O-line at a higher level than Nick? He answers yes. Okay, that's a great question, because this is the first year that D'Amico really focused his attention on the offensive side of the ball, spent more time with the offense during training camp and during the season. D'Amico's been really, really good at identifying those swarm-type players on defense. They haven't done a great job of getting a bunch of guys on offense that are those swarm type of players. I think that Woody Marks this past year very much fits the bill. I think Tank Dell, even though his size doesn't help him out at all, is a swarmy type of player. Nico Collins was already here when D'Amico got here, but he's a swarmy type of player. Are they able to get more of those guys? And does D'Amico start to have with the more attention devoted perhaps to the offensive line side of things, does he get those guys? David Montgomery is that type of player. I think he fits the mold of what D'Amico really, really wants. He breaks tackles. He's really good in short yardage. He does all those things really well. He's also going into his 8th year. I feel like we've come full circle a little bit since the Texans drafted Woody Marks, because when Woody Marks was drafted, in my mind and in a lot of people's minds, they thought, wow, boy, Joe Mixon and Woody Marks could be some sort of a version of what they have up in Detroit with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs is a different type of athlete. He's kind of like a Woody Marks on nitrous, but he's still a receiving threat. He's a running threat. He can do all of those things. You pair him up with kind of a head basher like David Montgomery. That's a really good combo to have. So that's what we were thinking about last year was, oh man, Joe Mixon and Woody Marks, you got that same dynamic they have up in Detroit. Well, it turns out that Joe Mixon was not going to play football at all this season. He might never play football again. We don't know. Nick Caserio doesn't know. I would expect that it's more likely than not that before free agency begins, Joe Mixon ends up being released unless they feel like it's worth holding on just in case. I don't know. But you do have that potential, that 1-2 punch with those guys there. If we look at the running attack this year, there were a couple times where D'Amico had pointed out that, hey, some things in the run game aren't just the O-line. There's times there where the blocking is there, but the running backs aren't necessarily doing everything with it. And I agree with that. And I'm not trying to take any of the blame away from the offensive line. It's not like they were awesome run blockers or anything, but there was a little bit of Woody Marks learning how to be an NFL running back. I thought he left yardage on the table at times, didn't always make the right read. Nick Chubb just simply wasn't the same guy that he used to be, and that even if he was seeing things better, he couldn't always hit it the way he used to hit. So some of the holes would close up and without the running back hitting it while it was still open. Hopefully David Montgomery and then 1 year of Woody Marks being in this system and being in the NFL, you start to get a better feel for that working out. The trade compensation for this was pricey. This was really, really pricey. This was something that could you have gone out and gotten this in free agency for less money or obviously fewer trade picks, or was there another trade available? I think if there's one thing we've learned about the running back market in both the draft and in free agency, from year to year, you just really can't predict it. It's 1 year, nope, nobody's going to pay for running backs. And then all of a sudden, Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley go for a king's ransom. Texans end up trading for Joe Mixon at that point. I think that might have played a little bit into Nick's willingness to be aggressive in getting a running back and getting that sewn up so that when you enter the draft, you don't feel pressure that, all right, maybe you're sitting there at the back of the first round and Price out of Notre Dame is available. But man, I don't know about running back at this price, but we really need a running back. You don't want to be tempted by drafting for need any more than you need to. You get this off the board and immediately you've already got an extra 5th round pick that you picked up because you traded away Tytus Howard this morning, that they might value having a little bit of certainty there. And it doesn't mean that they can't still draft a running back or perhaps even get another guy in free agency to add to the milieu back there. But I'm okay if it was a little bit more aggressive. One thing somebody pointed out was that with the initial trade report, I believe from Adam Schefter, being that it was for a 5th round pick, that maybe this was one of those situations where the Texans had to deal with Detroit. Somebody leaks information about the trade, and then somebody else jumped in to see exactly what they got for David Montgomery, and that maybe they sweetened the pot. I don't like that necessarily from a Texans perspective because it feels like they're not necessarily as much hardcore in control as possible. One of you had asked how many carries per game we should expect out of David Montgomery. I'd say like this year, obviously, Jahmyr Gibbs had a hell of a season, and he really just took off and came into his own. Going down through this last season, at any given time in the first half of the season, David Montgomery was getting between 10 to 15 carries per game. Second half of the season, it scaled back a good amount. And that's where a lot of the speculation about David Montgomery getting traded came out in the offseason. And then it really reached a fever pitch during the combine this week. And of course, there were people that reported that David Montgomery was going to get traded or he wanted to get traded. And there were other people saying, yeah, these are all just rumors and speculations. I think David Montgomery himself may have called it fake news or something thereabouts. Lo and behold, he gets traded today. And Mike Garofalo, I believe, reported basically that the Texans were David Montgomery's preferred destination, which is nice to hear. I think the Texans still very much are a place that people want to be. D'Amico's got really good PR around the league, amongst players, on television itself, all of that. And I think it's very enticing as a pitch to either potential trade targets who, there's not very few guys have no trade clauses, but teams don't want to trade for guys that don't want to go to that team. It just makes things messier and stickier than they need to be. That I feel good about that whether it comes to free agency or guys that want to sign 1-year deals, it's not necessarily the Patriots back when guys would just go there because they had a chance to win a Super Bowl. But I think when there are veterans who want to go to a place on a 1-year deal, they want to be on a competitive team. They want to go to a place where it looks like it's fun to play football there and they might be able to showcase their best abilities. Montgomery probably looked at the Texans for all of those reasons and thought, okay, it's a good fit, except for that little minor detail of the offensive line. Because it sure is. They've had some really good defensive lines in Detroit up there over the past few years. They fell off a little bit this year, and I'm sure Montgomery noticed the difference. But to answer the question, do you think Montgomery will get more or less than 20 carries per game? I'm going to say I would say less than 20 carries per game. I think I'd be surprised if he got anything approaching that. I think they're looking at this as a 1-2 combo with Woody Marks and Woody Marks and David Montgomery, and then whoever they end up adding to the mix. As far as Super Bowl odds, which again I wouldn't expect these to change at all, the Texans are kind of they're stuck down at plus 2,000 in a big jumbled mess with the Denver Broncos, the Jacksonville Jaguars, San Francisco 49ers, and then the Texans all at plus 2,000 down around 12th or 13th. I try not to look at the odds makers, and that's at FanDuel, by the way. I try not to look at the odds makers as the seers of the future and everything, but it is a more objective look at where the Texans are right now. If you based the Super Bowl odds on nothing but the defense, you would put the Texans right up there near the top. If you based it on nothing but the offense from last year, I mean, you look at that offense and you say, I don't even care what kind of maybe respectable numbers they put up. They didn't look like a team that was ready to do what they needed to do offensively in the postseason. And today is a good start, but it needs to be so much more than just this, obviously. I mean, it's a good start. I say it's a good start. They got away from they got rid of arguably their best offensive lineman. So they've got to find a left guard, a center, a right guard, and a right tackle. Unless you think Blake Fisher is that right tackle. Unless you think that Jarrett Patterson or Jake Andrews is definitely the go-to at center and left guard. And that's not the way the Texans felt about it at left guard. Nick very much opened the door to Jake Andrews. Basically, I guess to paraphrase what he said, Jake Andrews can compete and play as a starter, but he left the door open for there either being an improvement or an upgrade or just competition at center. Ed Ingram, I'm very cool with them re-signing Ed Ingram at the right price. Some of the numbers I've seen floated out there were somewhere around $15 million per year. Personally, I think that's too expensive for Ed Ingram. I don't blame Ed Ingram for going out and seeing if he can get that. But if it's something less than that, bringing him back as a guy that's got familiarity with the system, is a much swarmier offensive lineman than some of the other guys there. He's a good run blocker, first and foremost. There's a guy who's got familiarity with your system, and then you've still got 3 spots to fill in. Trent Brown, I'm cool with as a swing tackle, but I don't want to have to go into a season expecting him to play 17 games plus the postseason. Trent Brown's been in the NFL for 11 years. He's only played 3 full NFL seasons where he had over 1,000 snaps. In the last 10 years, he's averaged 637 snaps per game. I did the math this morning. So by way of comparison, when an offensive lineman starts the entire season, he usually gets 1,000 or more snaps per game. So that's just, you should expect at best like 60% of snaps or so for a 33-year-old guy who's still recovering from a patellar tendon tear from 2 years ago. Does this change the draft outlook? I think yes, in a couple of ways. One is obviously running back doesn't become as much of a pressing concern. I don't think they'll turn down the chance to draft a running back if they think there's good value there, but it's not a desperate need or a desperate concern. Offensive line becomes that much more of a priority. And I know most of you people watching or most of us Texans fans have felt like offensive line needs to be a priority. A lot of the mock drafts have been sending defensive tackles to the Texans in the first round. I get where these guys are coming from. If you think about it from a mock drafter's perspective, they're doing 32 teams. They're looking at the Texans depth charts and they're seeing that, wow, the Texans have some guy named Togiai. Never heard of him. Yeah, he's awesome. He's awesome. But most mock drafters don't know that just yet. Tommy Togiai was a revelation this year. And then Mario Edwards, and that's it. Like, that's it for guys that played last year or were at least were in the plans. That are just viable starting NFL defensive tackles. And most people aren't looking at those guys as difference makers. I've got a much higher opinion of Tommy Togiai than a lot of other people. I think the priority between now and the draft for me, one of the less heralded and won't move the headlines or anything, but things that are crucial to happen is that you re-sign either one of Tim Settle or Sheldon Rankins. And I think Sheldon Rankins a guy that the Texans have let walk out the door before. They got him back at a discount because Sheldon Rankins had a really miserable season in terms of illnesses and injuries when he was up in Cincinnati. And they got him back at a good discount. And I think he outperformed that contract. What's the market like for him out there in free agency now that he's 2 years older? Well, he's 2 years older than the last time he was coming off an impressive season. Last year, he was a year older and not coming off of a very good season. I think there's a really good chance that the Texans let him test free agency, but he still comes back to the Texans. I think Tim Settle also had an underrated, really important year for the Texans. Foley Fatukasi, likewise. I think he has a lot of value to the team, and he can make a difference. But in getting a couple of those guys back, I don't go into the draft thinking, oh, you have to get a stud defensive tackle, because they were one of the best 2 defenses in the league last year without having a guy like that, like a guy that you're drafting in the first round that you can hope develop into an all pro type of tackle. Tight end remains a priority, I think. Running back, take him if you see fit, but the offensive line, and Nick technically doesn't draft for need. He wants to say he drafts the best player available. One thing they do is he moves around a lot. Like last year, they move around a lot, and lo and behold, they end up taking the 2 biggest positions of need, the 2 consensus positions that everybody wanted them to draft. They took 2 wide receivers and 1 offensive lineman with their first 3 picks. So I think that's what it ends up looking like. I think they're going to move around, and they're going to end up, depending on what happens in free agency, at least 1 offensive lineman there. Now, if they Mario Edwards, I see a comment there that somebody mentioned Mario Edwards. Mario Edwards is not a free agent, so that's why I didn't include him in that discussion. But the if they go out and they sign 3 offensive linemen via trade or free agency, they still need to draft offensive linemen. It's just they're in that precarious a position right now. This is a make it or break it year for CJ Stroud. If he doesn't get an extension right now, and I'm expecting that I don't think he'll get an extension this season. I personally wouldn't be surprised if CJ wants to bet on himself when it comes to those types of things, that he's not happy with the performance he had this year and he wants to be that much better. you can't go into it feeling like there are 4 positions up for grabs on the offensive line. And it's time to maybe pay through the nose and get a little uncomfortable in paying for veterans that can come in. And even if they're disappointments as free agents, they're still good offensive linemen. So when I say a disappointment as a free agent, I don't mean a free agency bust, but if you pay a guy free agency market dollars and he doesn't end up being a Pro Bowler or an All Pro, that he's still a viable offensive lineman, because you got to have 5 competent, viable guys up there. So Eric Weinberger says this is excellent, Seth. Today 32 says go O-line heavy in the draft. Yes. Cade Mays, a lot of people wanting Cade Mays. Yes. I think, okay, so when it comes to centers, man, I love Tyler Linderbaum. Man, I think he's a tone setter. This morning, we were talking about how Tytus Howard wasn't worth $22 million. But then Sean and I were saying, yeah, but I think I think Tyler Linderbaum is worth $20 million a year as a center, if that's what he ends up getting. And a couple of people said, wait a second, you're talking about an offensive tackle versus a center. Right. Tytus Howard is an offensive tackle who's a competent offensive tackle. Tyler Linderbaum is one of the 2 best centers in the league. And it's hard to find guys like that in free agency. And he's a tone setter for the entire position group. So that's why I would be willing to pay that much for Tyler Linderbaum, because he's elite. And I got a hankering for elite O-line play. I mean, that's flat out. It's the non-negotiable thing. It's been too long. I've had it. I feel like the woman who's told her husband a million times, all right, if you don't stop coming home from the bars at 5 a.m. and smelling like perfume, I'm leaving. And that seems like a reasonable enough ultimatum. Does it not? Does it not? And yet, every May, I feel like Nick Caserio is walking out of the draft and he smells like perfume and he's got lipstick on his collar, and his transgression, his paramour, is horrible offensive line play. I will not be cuckolded by poor offensive line play any longer. And that's the damn end of it. Everybody, please subscribe. Thanks to FanDuel for sponsoring the Believe in Texans podcast. You can subscribe also to my YouTube channel. Really appreciate that. These two are kind of symbiotic and work in conjunction. Sometimes what I'm going to start doing is on my own personal YouTube channel, I'm going to take the audio and put it on Believe for the podcast version. So you guys don't have to be, trying to watch me while you're driving down the road. You can get me an audio version on Believe in Texans whenever you want. Thanks, everybody.